Welcome back to News Talk. Hillary Clinton's team, as you just heard, breathing easier after her strong showing in Nevada, a win that came just days after polling had her in a dead heat with rival Bernie Sanders. She's clearly now hoping to generate some new momentum ahead of the huge delegate haul across the South on Super Tuesday, a week from today. Sanders, however, continues to fight back hard. Correspondent Cecilia Vega continues our coverage.
Overnight, Hillary Clinton popping up on the set of Scandal. Star Scott Foley sharing this Instagram of Clinton with himself and President Fitz. Clinton on a fundraising trip to Los Angeles, where she attended a $2,700 per person event at the home of a Hollywood executive.
Thank you, Nevada!
After winning 76% of the African-American vote in Nevada, she's counting on South Carolina, where more than half of Democratic voters are expected to be black. Clinton also launching another new ad featuring one of the most well-recognized voices in America, actor Morgan Freeman.
She says their names.
Trayvon Martin, shot to death. Dontre Hamilton, unarmed.
Bernie Sanders is turning to a different prominent African-American actor, Danny Glover. While attacking Clinton as a political opportunist.
And the people of the United States need to know the difference between hastily adopted campaign rhetoric and the real record and the long-held ideas of the candidates.
Sanders' team says that while they haven't given up on South Carolina, where Clinton enjoys a massive double-digit lead, they are focused on Super Tuesday. Sanders hoping for wins in places like Colorado, Oklahoma, Minnesota, and Massachusetts.
Cecilia Vega, thanks. We continue our conversation now with Politico reporter Kevin Robillard. He's here in the studio, and joining the conversation, Callum Borchers, national political reporter for the Washington Post. Callum, thank you very much for your time. Let me start with you. To what extent is the Sanders team, to what extent is candidate Bernie Sanders in a bit of a struggle right now, a bit of a moment, trying to regenerate some of the momentum akin to what he had out of his big New Hampshire victory?
Yeah, I think Sanders is at a turning point here, right, where in Iowa, sort of the standard was really just come close, and you saw the coverage coming out of Iowa really playing it like a Sanders win, even though he had lost by a fraction of a point, and that was because he had overperformed so well, and he talked about the momentum. Well, he talked about momentum again after Nevada, but I think even he acknowledged on Sunday when he was making the rounds on the Sunday talk shows that momentum and coming close isn't going to be good enough for very much longer. You know, Super Tuesday rolls around, you've got 11 states on the Democratic side. He's going to have some real wins and not just keep it close and take away a moral victory.
Callum, let's talk about how campaigning changes as we move from these dates on the calendar where there's a single contest here or there with many days leading up to the caucus or primary, so candidates and their supporters and their volunteers can flood the zone and do a lot of the retail politics that we so associate, particularly with a place like New Hampshire, but also Iowa. Is it harder to put wins on the board when you're basically flying from city to city and at most doing an event on an airport tarmac?
It's harder to put wins on the board, and I think it really, that type of format where you have so many elections going on one day, it really favors a candidate who has a huge campaign infrastructure, right? So we've talked about the ground game in Iowa and New Hampshire, and sometimes I think those narratives are a little bit overplayed because when you're only focusing on one place, you know, any candidate, even an upstart who isn't, funded by a lot of outside money, can easily make the push right there. It becomes much harder to multitask if you're a guy like Bernie Sanders, who brags all the time about not having a super PAC that's flooding the airwaves in all these different states. To divide his attention among 11 states for one day, that is a much steeper challenge. You're absolutely right.
Kevin, what are you watching for as we get past South Carolina and the so-called Super Super Tuesday comes and we have what some are calling the SEC primary?
Yeah, so really for the SEC primary, you have, obviously, the African-American vote is very crucial. The other thing to really look for is how well Sanders does in some of the remaining caucus states. So if you look, Minnesota has a caucus, Colorado has a caucus. Sanders has done better Sanders obviously has won sort of the one primary that's happened so far, but there is a theory that Sanders can do better in those caucus states just because his supporters are a little bit more energized than Hillary's supporters. So that could be a way for Sanders to sort of stay in the game for a little bit longer, even if Hillary sort of racks up huge margins in some of the southern states with big black populations and in some of the larger states, places like New York.
As most people watching us probably know, with a primary, you go to your neighborhood polling place typically, and you can go morning, noon, or night, whenever it's convenient for you. A caucus is an event that happens at a given time, often in the evening. If you can't get there at that moment, you're not a participant. So the theory being that it rewards those with the most energized supporters.
Yeah, and that's how this works. You know, you saw that in Iowa with Ted Cruz. His supporters were, you know, sort of homeschool types, a lot of people who were very enthusiastic about his candidacy. You've seen that a lot with Sanders, too. Sanders has, you know, as any reporter who's on Twitter will tell you, Sanders has the most energetic supporters of any candidate in this race, with perhaps the exception of Donald Trump. So, yeah, that's a place where Sanders can perhaps rack up some victories.
Callum, ultimately, this is all about getting the number of delegates you need to seal your party's nomination. We've been talking about victories and losses for the most part up until now. Does the calculation change? Does the conversation change after Super Tuesday with all those states and all those delegates? Does the delegate count become more of a thing?
I think it becomes much more of a factor. It becomes much more a part of the conversation. And already you've heard a little bit whispers of it, but we're still so early in the process that those numbers haven't gotten big enough. But the problem for Sanders is that some of these states coming up become winner-take-all states, right? So it's like Texas is a good example. A lot of delegates on the board right there, and so that's another one where he can't just come close and say, well, we just about split. And then the other factor, of course, is those super delegates, which really could come back to bite Sanders eventually. We've heard a little bit coming out of New Hampshire about how right now the delegate split is actually 15-15. It's even between Clinton and Sanders, and you scratch your head and say, how can that be? He won 61-38. But the fact of the matter is that 6 of the 8 superdelegates who don't have to vote according to the primary results have already said that they're going for Clinton. There's 2 still undecided, but they could end up going to Clinton, and you might end up in a weird situation where Clinton just got shellacked in New Hampshire, but still ends up with more people representing her at the convention.
8 years ago, Hillary Clinton stayed in the race even after the math started to be problematic. Is that the template that others, notably in this case Bernie Sanders, I mean, is that the new normal that we could be looking at?
I think it is. I mean, you heard him talk about taking this fight all the way to the convention floor, and I think he's in a position where I think you have to remember that at the outset of this campaign, I think that if you gave him the truth serum, so to speak, I would be willing to bet that he didn't think he had a really good shot to win the nomination, but that he did have a really good shot to influence the conversation in the election and influence his party's platform come convention time. And if that remains the goal, if Clinton, let's say she pulls ahead in the next few weeks and really becomes clearly the presumptive nominee, staying in the race could still allow him to pile up more delegates and really sort of flex some muscle on the floor come convention time so that he can get some of those things on the agenda for the party platform. That would be a worthwhile reason to stick around in his mind, potentially.
Can you amplify on that, Kevin, because that's an interesting thought?
Yeah, I mean, Sanders sort of got in this race to pull Hillary Clinton to the left. He wasn't in it to win it originally. I think at a certain point Sanders realized he might have a chance at winning it and then maybe changed his mind a little bit.
The rest of
but
us too.
Sanders was in there, he thought Hillary Clinton wasn't going to be liberal enough on issues like taking on Wall Street, on things like student loans, and he probably still doesn't think Hillary Clinton's liberal enough, although he definitely has poked and prodded her further to the left. And, in other ways, sort of the environment poked and prodded her further to the left. I think she's gone further on sort of some civil rights issues and issues affecting African Americans because that's been a group she's been trying to turn out than she otherwise might have. So he's succeeded already in pushing Hillary Clinton a little bit to the left, but I think there are specific floor fights that his people might want to engage in and might want to win in terms of shaping the Democratic Party's platform, in terms of setting up the rules for sort of future conventions. There's all sorts of different things that an insurgent might want.
Callum, we only have about 90 seconds left. I want to ask you about something we talked with Kevin about a moment ago. Marco Rubio, is there an opportunity for him? He's winless so far, but as people like Jeb Bush drop out and there's pressure on John Kasich to follow him out the door, could he coalesce the anti-Trump vote under his banner at this moment?
He still could, certainly. Time is running out, though. You know, Trump is pulling ahead, and I think one of the most alarming things, if you're sort of in that establishment lane and you're hoping people will coalesce around Rubio, is that Quinnipiac poll out of Ohio this morning, right, that showed Donald Trump leading John Kasich, the sitting governor there, by 5 points. I think there was some thought that maybe it could actually be good for Rubio if Kasich stays in the race. Maybe he could kind of play defense, so to speak, and block Trump in some of those Midwestern states like Ohio and Michigan. But if that doesn't play out, and all Kasich does is stay in the race and pull votes away from Rubio without stopping Trump from winning those states, then that could really backfire, of course.
And of course, Ted Cruz has his wheels stuck in the mud at the worst possible time. Great result in Iowa, and it's been one thing after another ever since, seemingly.
Yeah, having to dismiss your communications director was not a good look, and it really seemed like something he had to do as kind of a symbolic thing because he was getting hit for running this dishonest campaign. I don't know if what we saw from Rick Tyler on Rubio was any worse than what we saw in Ben Carson in Iowa, but when you start to see a pattern and there's a perception that you're not running a clean campaign, you got to do something, right?
Callum Borchers of the Washington Post, Kevin Robillard of Politico, thank you both very much. Great conversation. We appreciate your time. We'll step aside. We're back with more News Talk right after this.